All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this open class for Signum University's class on C.S. Lewis and Mythologies of Love and Sex. I am Brenton Dickieson. I'm going to be joined by Jason Lepojärvi. Is that right?
Perfect.
Good. And Diana Pavlac, who will be joining us in a few minutes, who is finishing up her class out in California, a different kind of coast than I know. I'm here on Canada's East Coast, and Jason's actually in Ontario. I called it Northern Ontario, but it's actually middle bottom third of Ontario, not really a coast unless we call the Great Lakes a coast. And so we're going to be joining together in a discussion in this hour, which we've opened up to the digital universe for you to join us. And we have dozens of people, dozens of names here, and we're going to try to combine two things. One is the open concept, the massive online open concept of being able to talk about big ideas in front of the watching world. This will be recorded also for Signum University's YouTube channel, but also we're going to try and include some intimacy with that, as we would in a Signum University class. So bringing those two things together, we're going to do the crazy thing of, after these kind of initial comments and some introductions and things, we're going to try and open up the microphones as well as the online question box and give this a try to see if we can hold these things together. I'm just going to check to make sure that we are recording, because that would be, yes, good, excellent. And yeah, so that's great. So I'm going to introduce myself and then give some of the game rules for tonight, and then we'll do some introductions of our special guests. So good stuff. So I'm Brenton Dickieson. I'm one of the profs at Signum University, and I have just completed a PhD in C.S. Lewis and spirituality, going through his entire works, and I'm excited to be able to teach at Signum, where we get to deep dive into the works by people like C.S. Lewis, but especially J.R. Tolkien and the Inklings, and some of the leading figures in fantasy literature, imaginative literature, speculative fiction, and as well as some medieval and classical languages and literature. It's a really amazing program. I'll give a plug for that a little later in the, I almost said show, in the hour. I'm thinking of this, I guess, kind of like a podcast. So yeah, so I'm pleased to be able to be a part of this, and you can always check out links from this event on my blog at apilgriminarnia.com, as well as in the YouTube channel of Signum University that will follow. So tonight we're going to be joined by a couple of my friends and scholars of C.S. Lewis and the Inklings. But I wanted to let you know, because this is an open classroom, we're going to try and take questions for those who want to by audio. As this is recorded, it means you'll be part of the recording that will come later, which will be just fine. And so I want to test the hand-raising event. So I'd love you to give this a try. Open up your GoToWebinar dashboard, and I want you to raise your hand just so I can see that you have figured out the hand-raising feature. Look at that, it's just lighting up. The whole screen's lighting up there, which is great. And so I encourage you to Good. I encourage you to do that. And so that's how I know when we get to the open conversation, that's how I know you want to speak out loud. But you can at any moment go ahead and put a question in the question box, and I'll try and moderate all these things together, and we'll do our best to keep the conversation going on Narnia and friendship. And hopefully we'll do this in a friendly way. All right, Diana, do you want to give us a wave there?
Hi, how you doing?
Good. I've just been doing the rules, letting people know that the session will be recorded and kind of how it will work. Okay. And so now I want to do just a quick intro. Both the mics of our guests sound great. So we've got Jason Lepojärvi, who's now we've converted to Canadianism. Actually you're half Canadian anyway, right?
I am, yeah. My mom was born in British Columbia.
Yes, and you lived in British Columbia for at least a year or two, right? So
yeah, just 2 years.
Yes, that's right. Jason and I have shared some time at Regent College in beautiful Vancouver, and we're
Brenton,
pleased.
do you remember when we met? Do you not remember where we met?
I think it was Oxford, wasn't it?
Yes, the Eagle and Child, possibly.
Yeah,
Maybe
that's right.
maybe we got some people jealous or
Yeah, that's
envious.
right. Well, they actually just announced, and I don't know that this is really the end of the world news, but they've just announced that the Eagle and Child's opening a hotel
Yeah.
above and beside it. So if people are really interested in going to where, all these ideas of the Inklings were born, you're welcome to go ahead and do that. So Jason has done his PhD in C.S. Lewis's Theology of Love, and so that's why we want to talk with him tonight. And you were doing a research fellowship at Oxford when we met, and did some talks with the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society, and now you're actually teaching at Thorneloe University, which is one of the collective of Laurentian's university schools, right? So good, excellent. And your husband and a father of three, which is really nice. And what I'll do is when I repost the video, I'll put social media links for all our folks here as well. Now, Diana Pavlac Glyer is, of course, been a name in C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Inkling studies in a way that we would recognize for some time. The first book I bumped into hers was The Company They Keep, which is, this is one of these, I may have said this to you before, but like, how some bands become like an overnight success after 10 years on the road, and this is that kind of book, right? This is became a real success after 20 years of work or something. Is that right? A labor of love. A great example of deep dive scholarship for people that want to look intimately at these things. And she'll speak briefly kind of about how this works from her perspective. And then also a popular level book called Bandersnatch, which also encourages people who are artists beyond just kind of Inklings lovers, people who are artists who want to learn about collaboration and the development of art and writing and those sorts of things. A beautifully written and designed book, actually, and read by Michael Ward, I believe, in the audiobook. Is that right?
Right.
Yeah, good stuff. Excellent. So, and did you just come off the C.S. Lewis retreat?
Yeah, I was at Montreat at I guess they're calling it an international symposium, which is code for Doug Gresham was there from Malta. Yeah, and we had close to 600 people there at that event. It was really quite an extraordinary thing in every way. It was great. We had a great time.
That's really intense. Actually, I've always wanted to go. It's actually not terribly far in Canadian driving terms, just 20 hours or so drive from where I am, and yet I just haven't been able to get there midterm. Both are, yeah. Someone notes here, both our scholars tonight were keynote speakers. Our keynote speakers at Taylor this coming summer, right? The C.S. Lewis and Friends conference that's coming up at Taylor University. Both of you are on the ticket, I believe. Is that right?
My first time, Brenton, but you said somewhere that this is your favorite Inklings conference.
Yeah.
Tell us more. Like why do you like it so much?
Well, I think any academic conference you're going to get great papers, big ideas and that sort of thing. What Taylor does, which I really appreciate. I don't know how intentional this is or how accidental this is, but Taylor University with their C.S. Lewis and George MacDonald and Inklings archive, and then the C.S. Lewis and Inklings Society together have created a kind of culture where senior scholars go and they don't just kind of pop in for a keynote, but they sit and have lunch with people. They walk with younger scholars. There's an entire Young Inklings Day that precedes the conference, which is about encouraging critical thought and creativity in scholarship, in speculative literature and other things, and archival work. So it's just such a generous spirit, and I know in scholarship. We may sometimes lack critical thought, but we very often lack a generous spirit. And I don't know, Diana, you've been there at least a couple of times. Is that your experience as well?
I think you said that very well. There is a sense of the tribe sort of coming together. There's a great sense of encouragement for new ideas and new papers. I think there's also a wonderful creativity. There's often theater, there's music. Goodness, there's sometimes even swing dancing. And it's a lot of fun to be able to celebrate and play and feast together, as well as to study and think and argue and engage together. And so you see all of that sort of happening there. I think it's an extraordinary thing. I'm excited about this coming event for a number of reasons, but one is that I'll get to talk more about my research on Warren Lewis. And with a little hope and prayer, my book about Warren Lewis's relationship with a missionary doctor. Lucy Blanche Biggs was her name. That book should be ready to release sometime. It'll be pretty close, but we'll see if we can get that ready for that conference.
That's right. Yeah. Good. Thank you. That's really cool. And
there's a blind spot in Lewis scholarship.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And we have had, if you actually look at the keynotes over the years, will typically be somebody who's filling in one of these spaces that we don't always tend to emphasize. And I think that's the name C.S. Lewis and Friends is nice actually for what we're talking about tonight. But to create kind of a bigger tent image of what we can possibly talk about. So a couple of years I used L.M. Montgomery and C.S. Lewis in conversation, which is not a terribly typical partnership. Yeah. So it's but it invites that sort of thing. Yeah. And Rich, who is a professor at another university and a Signum student, we met at this conference, one of my students, and he says, don't forget the shenanigans, the late night events and the receptions and the dinners and the music, and there was a great kind of a trio last time, and so it's a great event. It's lots of fun.
I'd encourage everyone who's listening to go and look up the event, and like Brenton said, there's a lot of writing contests and paper proposals and bursaries out there to help offset the costs. So I've been trying to encourage my own students to send in paper proposals, and so I really encourage you to go or join us.
There you go. And only a 26-hour drive from Prince Edward Island, so it's pretty close.
You can get from Europe to Africa.
That's true, but with a little more cost and a little less kind of comfort, I'm sure. So, and Emily here says, who's an artist who's had her work shown at the conference, and we may have met for the first time, Emily, at the conference, notes that it's on her calendar, so we're looking forward to that sort of thing next year. So good stuff. Well, we could probably chat about life, the universe, and everything for the whole hour, but let's get into our topic, and it's actually not inauthentic to do that, right? Given that we're talking about friendship, to sit and chat or even argue about things would be within, I think, the way that the people we read imagine friendship. And so I wanted to just quickly, just as to make sure everybody's kind of signed in, I just wanted to note, and this is really less of sort of a mini lecture and more of a chance just to kind of point out what is sometimes amiss or sometimes not noted in reading Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Let me just share my screen here. And it's that you could really go a lot of places on friendship and C.S. Lewis. I would argue that it's actually one of the critical frameworks that he uses both instinctively and overtly throughout all his work in different kinds of ways. And we'll have Jason and Diana touch on that here in a moment. But just in terms of Narnia and not his science fiction, That Hideous Strength, I think is designed as a friendship question book. Till We Have Faces, I think, has some beautiful ideas and thoughts about friendship. But I wanted to go to the Voyage of Dawn Treader because I think the whole thing is actually structured to think about friendship from the very first page. And I hope this is coming across for you folks because I've got little boxes covering all my stuff here. From the very first page, we have, Eustace Clarence Scrubb, who, the narrator can't tell you what his friends thought of him because he had no friends. And so this is, Lewis doesn't always write very amazing first paragraph of Narnia books, right? That's not always his best writing, but they're always important things to look at right from the beginning. And you're going to find the friendship theme all the way through, to this critical point of Rinpoche, who says, friendship and honor are actually that's the way that Rinpoche understands fealty, and is through friendship. That's the framework. But it's actually kind of, I think, bound into all this, the quest that the Narnians must go on, that they're joined by this human family, Eustace and the two Bevansies. This quest is actually to find his father's friends, Caspian's father's friends, not just the lords of the land, not people that he had responsibility to, but actually friends. And Caspian, when he addresses his crew, he calls them friends. This is how he understands kingship, is actually as a kind, and I don't know, his work as a sort of king captain is through friendship. It's a kind of a critical moment, including into battle. Now for it, friends. Raise your swords. It's time for us. It's time for us to go into this moment. And Edmund, when they meet Ramandu's daughter, there's this question: how do we know you're our friend? It's not how do we know that this is safe, or how do we know whose side you're on, but how do you know we're unfriend? And I don't want to take much more time to go through, but because I want to note just a couple of really kind of poignant moments when it comes to friendship, because I think friendship is one of the frameworks of the book. Eustace was terrible. He didn't just have no friends, because of the circumstances, but because he was, a terrible human being, right? In a lot of ways. But of course, when he becomes a beast, he actually becomes less beastly to others, and he becomes a more human kind of a friend. And it's when he's finally by himself, left alone, that he finds that he wanted to be friends. He wanted to be back among humans and to share things with them. And so there's this lovely kind of upside downness that takes place in the text. And actually, it turns out that Eustace is a better friend to the ship. He's always avoiding work, always causing trouble. But when he becomes a dragon, when he's least actually capable at offering friendship in normal ways, he becomes a better friend. And actually not a bad friend to the beast that he kills for them either. Apparently he does that quickly enough that there's some humaneness there as well. But friendship can go wrong. Remember Lucy, if you watch Lucy in Friendship all the way through, that I think that's how she negotiates her leadership in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, is through friendship. Quite unusually, as a girl on a ship of men and a few boys, and a few other animals that are male. And so that's an important kind of category. But Lucy, of course, breaks. She reads this spell about what her friends think of her, and that actually breaks friendship. So there are moments where friendship can falter. The friends are at one point in danger on Goldwater Island or Deathwater Island. They're in danger of fighting one another. So there are moments that friendship can break. But friendship remains kind of the critical question in this. And I think one of the loveliest moments, Rinpoche, they're trying to decide what to do with the dragon that's kind of, landed on their shores, and Eustace, who's a problem, and Reep says, this creature is no friend of mine, but he is the Queen's blood, and while he is one of our fellowship, it concerns us to find him and avenge him if he is dead. So there's this loyalty, but then Rinpoche then moves in upon this, and he actually becomes a friend to the sad dragon. And so there's this moment, and one of the pictures I used online was the picture of Rinpoche and the dragon sitting side by side, and Rinpoche telling stories to the dragon, who's in quite a sad state. He's unable to undragon himself, and so he needs friendship. And so I think that I'll leave you to explore the text yourself. I think it's a lovely way of rereading the text, but just to kind of highlight the importance that friendship has. And Lewis is writing this for children at a children's level. I think that this is a deeper, more resonant theme. And so let's actually begin with Jason. Do you want to just fairly briefly address for us your concept of friendship and Yeah, yeah. And Takako says, you know, the Lucy's friend in the sea, right? Remember, she looks down over the edge of the boat and she sees this young girl, and it's as if she can, you know, she sees her and she knows that if they were to meet in real life, if there was not like the lid of the ocean between them, that if they were not different kinds of creatures that couldn't live in one another's environment, they would run up to each other and hold each other's hands and be friends. And so Lucy's capacity for friendship, I think, is pretty clear in the text. And that's actually where her power comes from. Before Aslan shows up in Deathwater Island, where when the boys are fighting, she says, you know, folks, you know, she steps in and tries to separate them, and she actually uses it in kind of a manipulative way when Caspian wants to go to the end of the world, and she says, well, Caspian, didn't you kind of say to Ramadu's daughter, you know, didn't you almost, you know? So there, she has this kind of very relational way of leadership that I think is valuable, and hard won. If you read Prince Caspian, her leadership, it takes a while for people to value her as a leader. So yeah, I think that's also worth noting. All right, Jason, do you want to just speak to it? What does friendship mean sort of philosophically, theologically for Lewis, and where the source material for that is?
Well, see, I wasn't brought up a Narnian. So I was in my mid-20s when I first read the Chronicles. I read other books by Lewis. I started reading him when I was 19 or 20 during my military year, and I brought a couple of books. I'll show them to you. They're quite funny. But so I'm in my mid-20s when I start reading Narnia, and so I'm late. I'm late in the game, and so every time I read it, I learn new things. Like now, I haven't really given much thought on friendship in Narnia. And you've got wonderful searchable electronic versions of all the books by Inklings and Beyonds, and so you punch in friends and all these wonderful quotes or friendship quotes appear, and they're very interesting. A thought came to me because you asked about the philosophical understanding of friendship, especially in the Four Loves. Not many of those passages that we just saw or highlighted reminded me of philia in the Four Loves. That may be a master's thesis for one of your students, because so the hypothesis would be that Lewis uses friendship, quote unquote, very loosely in Narnia. Whereas in the Four Loves, it has a much more narrower, more defined meaning. And so maybe what Lewis calls camaraderie or companionship in the Four Loves, he calls friendship quite liberally in Narnia. And so it might be, it would be really interesting to analyze the Chronicles of Narnia and to try and differentiate where does philia, the virtue, the love of friendship, when does their relationships actually rise to friendship with a capital F, and not just simply allies or a good buddy or trustworthy. Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
Oh, I think that's actually a great question, and I just want to. I anticipated you might say something like, I'll just put this back on the screen here.
We remember that the key characteristic of philia in the Four Loves was this, that the mutual passions or interests that form the matrix of friendship. It's not enough to be a good person and to just be a good person, like a good lover, kind to the other. For the relationships in Narnia to be philia, the friends in question should be joined by a common passion or an interest.
Diane? Do you think that a common quest is not enough of a common passion. You talk about camaraderie, and I think that that's an important distinction. But I wonder if, as a quest, which they're on, as a quest unfolds, doesn't that naturally draw people into a kind of friendship, of mutuality that they may not have had when they set out?
I think so. I think it a lot. Well, maybe I would say that a quest is like the matrix of a friendship. So from a quest, a friendship can arise, but a quest is the children find themselves, or many of the other characters find themselves in a quest, uninvited quest. They didn't choose the friends; they're just thrown into this story. And
Right.
so it's almost like, to use an analogy, you don't choose your schoolmates or your classmates when you're in elementary school. And so some of them become friends. But I think Lewis says somewhere that, you know, you meet someone who was your friend 20 years ago in school or whatnot, or military, and then you realize, we have nothing in common. Once the quest is over, we don't really want to hang out together anymore. So I don't know. Maybe.
I think you're right that not all quests, right, end up that way. But this one seems to me to be about a shared value. I think it starts with a little bit of a sense of adventure. You know, they're out to see what they can find. They're out to explore these islands and so on. But I think that there is a shared sense of the importance of these people and the value that they have in locating them and hearing their stories. And I think that that itself becomes a kind of thing that gives a focal point that does in fact draw them together.
Yeah, I suppose we could look at, or we should look at, individual relationships within the Voyage or the other chronicles, and take them by a case by case. And so, yeah, maybe some of them have all the potential of blossoming into like something more permanent and lasting, which doesn't wither away or is forgotten once the peril is over and you return home.
Yeah, but what you're talking about is more than a master's thesis. That's going to be someone's doctoral dissertation.
Well, we're always open.
You got to start somewhere. Start with one book and then expand.
Well, feel free, folks, if you're looking to do a master's or a PhD, reach out to these folks here. And then and of course, you know, Signum University does do a thesis-based master's where we value this sort of deep dive. What I appreciate about this, so we have Kate here. So twice Kate kind of anticipated where we were going. So just before Diana spoke, she said, or a quest, like asking the question, you know, what about a quest? So it's exactly kind of the thing we were saying. And then just before that, she said, you know, well, in For Love's, the idea of friends is sharing a vision outwards as opposed to lovers gazing at each other face to face, which is quite literally the quotation that I have on the screen. You know, the natural posture of lovers is face to face, but friends walk side by side, eyes looking ahead, and then mentions that questy stuff. You won't find the warrior, the poet, the philosopher, or the Christian, you know, looking in each other's eyes, you know, but, you know, fight with him, read with him, argue with him, pray with him. This is kind of, these are the activities of friendship.
But I like about friendship, I mean, about quest, that Diana brought up and others anticipated, is that very often when Lewis's understanding of friendship is discussed, some people have kind of their view of Lewis's understanding of friendship is a highbrow view. Like friendship is just intellectual friendship among dons who like literature and pipes. But if you read it carefully, Lewis says that the things that can join friends can be dominoes or white mice or stamp collecting, right? These are very highbrow hobbies or interests. And so what I like about quest is that you're thinking out of the box, you're expanding, you're reminding us that quite like the number of things that can bring friends together and glue them they're innumerable. There's so many things. And so I remember several conversations, often with women, in fact, where they say, although my mother thought that the chapter on philia was the best. She thought it was her favorite chapter in the Four Loves, the one on friendship. But many others have said that well, Lewis has a blind spot here, that, you know, when I talk to my friends, we don't need to talk about a subject. We talk about our families and children and our lives and our personal growth. And so I don't think Lewis's understanding of friendship is correct, without realizing that, well, they just listed these things that unite them, their family, their situation with small children, or their struggle, or their personality development challenges, or whatnot. These are actually, they actually corroborate, they support Lewis's understanding of friendship, and don't contradict it, really. Yeah. So quest, and just another thing that can unite. It's not even, we don't think about, because quest is more abstract than dominoes, right?
When we were at the Montreat Symposium, I had the privilege of listening to some of Hal Poe's observations, and he made a note that I've been really thinking about ever since. He helped to clarify something kind of important for me. He was trying to wrestle with the question of why it is that Lewis spends so little time talking about his wartime trauma, right? And so much time talking about the difficulty that he had in school. This is something that Lewis scholars have been kind of puzzling over and wrestling with. And often what's said is that Lewis is somehow suppressing his wartime experience in some way. And I think that Hal made a really important observation, and that's that what made Lewis's school experience so traumatic for him was his isolation, that he had not found his tribe. He didn't find the others that he connected with. He was bullied, he was isolated, he didn't play sports, he wasn't included. And that incredible day after day kind of loneliness and standing alone and feeling like you don't fit in and don't belong, in part because of his spectacular intellect, right? And the dullness of the educational opportunities there. And what Hal observed, and I think this is really interesting, is that when Lewis was on the front lines, when he was in the trenches, he became part of something. He was included in something. And Hal believes that experience was so astonishing and healing and helpful to be a member of a group where he was valued and his part was valued. In fact, because I guess one might say because of some accidental experiences in wartime, he was actually sort of a hero. And he hadn't played that role. He wasn't the sports guy who made the touchdown. You know, he wasn't the star of the team in other settings. And so it is astonishing to think about how important friendship is. Hal's theory, and I think it's really worth chewing on, is that Lewis's experience of finding friends within that wartime experience elevated that from trauma to something that was actually rather healing and helpful and hopeful for him in a lot of ways.
The difference between Lewis and Tolkien and their wartime differences in terms of their friendships, there is a difference. Lewis's friends died, so it's hard to evaluate assess that, because the idea that he developed friendships in the context of a quest, which was war, friendships lasted, because these friends don't exist anymore. They died. So we can't really test that hypothesis, really. But with Tolkien, there's a different problem that hinders our evaluation of that hypothesis, and it's that he went into the war largely with the friends that he exited the war, right? Two of them died, but one didn't, and they remained friends, but kind of later on estranged. So I can't think of actual friends that they made, lasting friendships that they made during the war. I'm sure the connection gave them a sense of meaning, and like you conveyed from Hal, that this meaning allowed them to recover quickly from the trauma, unlike childhood experiences.
It might be more accurate to call it belonging rather than friendship. I don't know, but I think that Lewis was so starved for it because of these school experiences. It's something significant. There's something there, and I hope to discover more about its nature. But I think it's a good observation. It's a good direction to head in.
Yeah.
He's also, we should remember too, like Lewis was hiding his experience from the people that were his friends, his brother, his best friend, his father. You know, the very few people that he knew. I read, you know, his best friend Arthur. I read his journals from the World War I period, and and Lewis wasn't telling him everything that was going on. We know that from the letters, but it was clear that that Arthur was figuring this out, and his brief notes, just the relief that comes off the page when Lewis finally shows up back home on Christmas, actually at the end of the war. And so it's a really kind of lovely moment, and actually how deeply lonely Arthur is, actually almost pathologically lonely he is during that period. So we can keep chatting. There's two things I want to note. One is that we have a whole bunch of comments here already from students, and so I want to do our best to moderate those. We won't be able to include all students, but we want to make this kind of as fun, as connected as possible. We want to play this forward and give Diana a chance to kind of make the links as you want. Diana, you can make the links to your work, and particularly to creative endeavors, or to moving the things that are the center of us back out into the world, that sort of thing. So make sure that you keep those things as part of the lesson there, beyond kind of general knowledge. And we do have a bit of a joke in our class about how long in a non-Jara Tolkien class does it take to mention one of Tolkien's works. There's a bit of a thing, and it didn't take long in our discussion to kind of go there. It's maybe a bit bigger than we want, but just some thoughts here. There's some kind of positive comments back on both Diana's comments and work and Jason's, from Donald and Kate here. And I also want to know Gabriel, Professor Schenk, actually, he notes, he sees the Voyage of the Untreader as negotiating friendship, isn't the word that he wants to use. And he says, there's camaraderie, but when you compare it to Four Loves, there's sort of a different thing. We think of the friendship and Surprised by Joy, and then Tolkien, he draws in Tolkien. And I use the image somewhere of Venn diagrams of friendship, right? So like all the people are on the quest, but not all the people are friends, but not all the people that are friends are on a quest, right? And so there's these kind of moments where friendship deepens. And so I wonder if we can then read sort of philosophies of friendship in depth back into what happens in what is a pretty brief text. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the longest of them, and is still of the Narnian Chronicles, and still a fairly quick moving. It's a very quick moving piece of work. Chris says, I think Eustace, Lucy, and Edmund become friends, not just cousins. So that's an interesting thing. We always have this renegotiation of what friendship means. And it comes because of their relationship with Aslan. So there's the quest, but then there's this kind of third idea that Aslan draws them together into a unit, which I think Christine gives us that nice note there. Lewis's experience were quite to the contrasts. So Kate wants to agree with Jason on some of the TCBS and Tolkien's friendships versus Lewis. And Daniel kind of notes that as well about the generation. They didn't talk about war, so there was that. We're using in Canada. We're using a holograph, hollow people to try and tell the stories of war to children that have never met somebody who fought in World War I or World War II, to try and keep those stories alive and engaged. And Kate says she'd like to see Diana talk about the idea of the quest when it comes to writing, creating, and friendship and fellowship. So, so that would make a great kind of transition if you want to just speak to that for a moment, Diana. And as she does that, as she prepares the lecture she's about to give there, I will invite, we're going to kind of open this up to, to what may fall apart. We've got dozens of names here on my screen. I would feel free to open this up. You can make comments and we'll get to as many of them and questions, especially for our panelists, as you can in the question box. Or if you'd like to speak out loud, I would encourage you to have, if you can, an earbud in your ear, just so that we don't get any echoes that may come from opening up the microphones. But if you raise your hand, I'll try and get to you and to your comment. If it just moves on or you don't want to ask it, that you can unraise your hand. You can just tap on the little button there and the hand will disappear. So we're going to give this a try. We don't usually do this with dozens of people, but we'd rather try and fail than not try at all. So Diana, do you want to speak to that idea of quest, friendship, process of writing, or creation, or other vocational aspects?
Sure, I'm happy to. I want to commend you, though, for working out all of the logistics of this complicated situation. It's pretty exciting to be in so many different places and yet to be together and tied together in this way.
And we have people from California to Japan right now on this session, so it's quite a lot. And I do have to apologize. I had like a pretty major Charlie horse during Jason's little moment there, and so I'm sitting here dying. Like I muted my microphone. I almost made the screen go away, but I didn't want to make people panic. And so now I'm okay now, but there are things that are caught on camera that you don't always want caught on camera, I suppose. So yeah, content is so good it gives you a Charlie horse. Someone comments here. Yeah, thanks, Rich. Yeah. All right, go ahead, Diana.
Especially when you're talking about the Inklings, I think that talking about the creative process, the process of writing The Lord of the Rings, or the process of writing a novel, or even a nonfiction book, I think that it's very fair to talk about that as a kind of quest where you have a grand adventure, you have obstacles to overcome, and persistence is one of the key virtues to get you through. And in order to do that, you need friends. And I love thinking very capaciously about the idea of collaborators. When I think about Lewis, one of the things about Lewis as a collaborator, I like to remember that he was born into collaboration, that he and his brother Warnie began collaborating together as soon as Lewis was able to do much of anything, talking, writing, drawing, telling stories. In the little end room at Little Lee, there they are, and they are creating worlds up there. They're drawing maps with trade routes and extensive kind of world building, the kind of thing that Tolkien himself would be proud of, I think, if he had known more about Boxen and Animal Land and India and these wonderful creative worlds. And so C.S. Lewis's creative imagination really is kindled in the context of this friendship with his brother, the shared worlds that they created and the ways that they integrated their stories into one another. That becomes fuller and more mature, more sophisticated in his relationship with the Inklings and the various web of connection that really becomes such an important aspect, I think, to all of these writers in many ways.
Yeah, no, I think and I love, you have a number of categories for thinking about it, but the collaborators and resonators, like those images still resonate for me, thinking about it, yeah. And of course, Lewis, was Warren, like when we think about the four loves, Storge being family love, Philia being friendship love, does Warren just remain in the Storge? No, there's this kind of not just an agape transformation, but there's also a friendship that develops there. And same with Joy Davidman, begins as this, friendship love becomes something different. So even Lewis's own categories kind of fall apart a little bit. It's just something I just thought of. There we go. Yeah. So good.
They don't fall apart so much as they begin to blend, and I think that may be a little bit different. We have to use language, right, to categorize and describe things. One of my great teachers used to always say that taxonomies or labels or categories, they always reveal certain things and obscure other things, and so they are useful for communication. And I think that however many Greek words for love you might want to focus on, I think that this language does help us to describe and to observe certain things.
Yeah.
Doesn't Lewis himself warn us about murdering to dissect?
Yeah.
Right? several
Yes.
times. These are conceptual distinctions. Reality is organic, so don't kill the object of your study. Remember always that these
Right.
are.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it's a gruesome analogy. This idea of dissecting a frog in a lab, in a science lab, and codifying the various limbs. There's a heart, there's a lung, but you end up killing it.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it's good to
Yeah.
remember.
But if you're careful, it looks like a lot more like an auto mechanic, right? Who can remove the muffler or the carburetor or all four tires, and at the
That's,
end of the day, that car still runs, right? So
runs even better.
there's a good way to do really good literary analysis that isn't death dealing.
I like that, Diane. I'm going to use that. I'm going to steal that. So the limitations of the dying frog are corrected in Diana's auto mechanic.
Well,
That's very good. I'm not being sarcastic. That's very good. Takes it
hopefully
apart, but is able to reassemble it,
yeah.
and because of these distinctions, it hopefully works even better after the reassembly.
Yeah, well, and hopefully the high school dissection class ultimately leads to the surgeons that do the real surgeries that we need, right? So the it's a neat image, but of course we've read literary critics who are vivisectionists, right? Not just
Yes,
murdering to
absolutely.
dissect,
Absolutely.
but actually pulling it, cracking open the chest on the table. Etherized or otherwise. So following up on this, so there's some nice comments here, and folks, if you want to speak your voice out, I think we need maybe a courageous person to be the first one to do that, so you can do that. Funny image, Kate says, that popped into her head was Lewis as Reepicheep sitting next to the dragonish Tolkien, who despaired of ever getting his Middle Earth out of his head and into the real world. And I think there's kind of a nice moment there. Although we can't always say the same about Tolkien when it came to Narnian encouragement, can we, Diana?
No.
No.
Well,
No.
since we're on Tolkien, just to humor the Tolkien fans out there, what do you think about what do you think about Tolkien's family relationships? How many did any of them rise to the level of philia? Like with Lewis and Warney, obvious brothers, but really they're friends. How about Tolkien and his relationships to the people in his family? What would you say? Were any of them real friendships?
Are you thinking of Christopher as a possibility?
Possibly, yeah. Maybe even Priscilla to some extent. I have my doubts about Edith, as blasphemous as that sounds, but
That sounds blasphemous.
yeah. No, I think they were in love. They had eros, they had storge, but did they have philia? Were they passionate about? I suppose, insofar as they were passionate about their children and thrived in collaboration and discussion about them and their future and their personalities, they had philia. But what else? What else? We have, you know this, Diana, better.
We do know that Tolkien shared a lot of his stories, a lot of his poetry, and particularly a lot of sections that we think of as being part of the Silmarillion with her. So she was familiar with that. She typed manuscripts, but then, that's not necessarily an important part. When I talk about the Inklings, I talk about the importance of resonators. Brenton, you were kind enough to use that word before. When the idea of a resonator is somebody who basically kind of vibrates at the same frequency, or I like to define it as someone who fundamentally understands what you're attempting and devotes themselves sacrificially and persistently to help you get there. And I think in that sense, she was a resonator. She may have not had a really deep and profound understanding of all that Tolkien had envisioned for Middle Earth, but I think she understood the essence of it or the nature of it. I think she resonated with it, and she resonated with that picture of the kind of world he wanted to build and the kind of character that would be embodied in the stories that he would tell. And I think she got it, and I think she did in fact devote herself to his success.
Yeah. So I think it's and of course we got a bunch of reactions as soon as Jason said that. So a bunch of people said Christopher as sort of philia, and of course we don't know that philia is the best way to fill out a family relationship, a Storge relationship. But it is a way that certainly Lewis would find profound and meaningful. Christopher certainly, but then when you said I don't know about Edith, Trevor here wrote my dear man, like. And
he called her my little one.
That's right. And Kate reminds that it does begin in the boarding house as probably something more like teenage friendship or something like that. And Gabriel says, that they shared Tallers and Edith shared novels, so there was a sort of a casualness to their reading, and some of the letters, Kate writes, some of the letters to CT read like a friend rather than just a father son. This is Christopher Tolkien. So particularly I think at war there was an intensification of the relationship. Yeah. Okay. So good. So we got our first hand up. This is, actually, Gabriel, this is a great yeah, and of course Noam is asking, I'll hold that question, Noam, because that's a really great question. Gabriel, I'm going to have Professor Schenk here go ahead and speak his voice up, and so he'll be the one that tests the waters here on this one. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Hi, Brenton. Hi, Jason, and hi, Diana. Thank you very much for the talk. A thought popped into my head about thinking about Lewis's friendships and thinking about Owen Barfield. And also Arthur Greaves, two kind of lifelong friends who he kept up with throughout his life and who had kind of profound influences on him. And both were at such a distance as well. I mean, Barfield came to Oxford when he could, but mostly he was sort of tied up in London, and yet no less of an influence. And in a kind of different way, but similar thing with Arthur Greaves in Ireland, them seeing each other when they could. And so I just thought I'd mention that because we do think of sort of friendship as being together, and certainly the Inklings being together and being able to see each other at least twice a week. And certainly there were those friendships with Charles Williams and Tolkien and Roger Lansdowne Green and so on. But that distance as well is just as vital in friendship for Lewis, I think, in thinking about his life and thinking about Narnia as well. That idea with Eustace, not in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but in
Silver Chair.
In the Silver Chair, yeah, and thinking about the Pevensies who he's away from. But sort of this sort of sense of like there's a kind of almost like a chivalric order of people who've been to Narnia. That's the kind of camaraderie, even though they're not together, they're united through Aslan. And I just sort of wanted to flag that up and hear from the panel what your thoughts were about that kind of friendship through distance.
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. That's a great question. And people should know that Professor Schenk is an expert on chivalric literature and Arthurian romance. So that's good. Thank you, Gabriel. That's great. Do either of you want to address that? And I also have like 3 or 4 great questions here in this panel. So go ahead. Yeah.
I'll observe just really quickly how much time Lewis spent writing letters to people. And so this idea of there being connections and vital connections with people that you'd even never met was something that he was familiar with. And so I think that that's a really interesting kind of slice or way to look at things.
Distance, you mentioned the word distance. I wonder if did Lewis, was he able to develop relationships despite distance, or partly because of distance? Or is it a combination of both? In itself, from his understanding of friendship, does not follow that you need to physically necessarily hang out all the time or often. So distance doesn't seem to be a hindrance. It doesn't seem to bar philia in any way necessarily. I suppose in Eros, maybe it applies to other forms of love as well, but distance sometimes adds value. And it can, it adds value to the relationship.
Yeah, I would observe in terms of the two people that were mentioned, Owen Barfield and Arthur Greaves, that those were friends that began in proximity, right? So with Owen Barfield, they become friends because they're exact contemporaries and they're in school together. So I don't remember, Jason, what the word was that you used, but there's a kind of scaffolding that these matrix that these kinds of situations can enable, I guess I would say. And for those two friendships, they began in that way with that kind of a matrix or a scaffolding, and then developed from there and were maintained from that, I want to say almost like an established route, right? So it's continued on past that, but that's not the only experience of it. And with Joy Davidman, of course, it starts the opposite way. Yeah, they start quite distant and then it grows. So he seems to have had a great capacity for friendship under a variety of terms and situations.
Let me turn that a little from distance, which I think you could see kind of a really literary lecture kind of come out of that image if Gabriel took the time to kind of let that play out, and go to something Alicia says here, which is the idea of darkness. You know, for me, she says the most moving passages about Narnia are the darkest parts. Lucy and Susan after Aslan dies, or the members of Tyrion's army on the night before the battle. Can you speak about how Lewis, I lost part of the question here, how Lewis portrays friendship, and I can't quite get all the question. It's a limitation of GoToWebinar that sometimes things are cut off. But how Lewis portrays friendship when it comes to darkness, I think would be the question. I think it's a good idea. Yeah, I just can't make the question bigger. I don't know what happened to the rest of it. So, and Alicia, if you could, if I've mangled your question, you can just go ahead and follow up here, and I'll try and get it right. Go ahead. What do you think about darkness? Basically, did you want to speak that aloud, Alicia, or?
Unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, you got most of it, but basically, could you talk about how Lewis portrays friendship in times of suffering? Just, I don't know, especially those dark parts. And it's funny, a lot of the times of suffering are very quiet for him. Like, they're times of waiting, they're times of grief. So yeah, I wondered if you have any thoughts about that.
Good. Thank you.
That's a difficult question.
It is a difficult one.
What comes to mind is maybe you remember his disagreement with Saint Augustine in the Four Loves. Right? The only time Lewis publicly, timidly, but courageously decides to go against his master, is one of his theological mentors, Augustine, on an important point concerning love. And he thinks it's so important that he has to voice his objection. And maybe you remember this bit, but it was about, well, not darkness, but vulnerability in love. Because I think he misreads and misunderstands Augustine and misremembers. Reading Augustine years ago had led a bad taste in his mouth, and he's critiquing this memory of the bad taste. But whether or not he understood Augustine correctly, the issue he raises is really important. And so he basically thinks Augustine is saying that as we progress in love, the less vulnerable we become. And overt grief in love or friendship, in this case, in Augustine's example, is a sign of imperfect love or incomplete, immature love that hasn't really evolved into its full potential. And Lewis says, no, this is absolutely wrong. This is far from Christianity, and it appeals to his sense of security and limited liabilities, all that stuff. But He's 1,000 miles away from the Spirit of Christ, and so he objects to Augustine, or his reading of Augustine, and just says that vulnerability is organic to love. And in Narnia, right, we're told that it's not only is it right to cry for what do you remember? It was right, not only right to cry for the loss of Narnia, but maybe even wrong not to cry.
Mm-hmm.
He turns Augustine's reading of tears upside down and says that, you know, sometimes not shedding tears is a bad spiritual symptom.
When I think about this question, it's a great question. Thank you so much for directing our attention there, because I think it's an important one. When I think of Lewis and grief and friendship, I can't help thinking of his description of what he felt when his mother died. And he talks about he and his brother being like two urchins huddled together for warmth, right? The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. But those two events are very closely tied for Lewis, his clinging to his brother, like a life preserver almost, right? And then the loss of the mother, like the loss of a continent. So it seems to me that in grief, that there is that impulse to kind of reach out and to find a connection. I see that also in a couple of other instances. For example, in A Grief Observed, right, at the other end of his life, when he's dealing with difficulty, he cries out to God very, very specifically and precisely, and there's that sort of clinging and reaching out. There's that kind of outward impulse there too. And so I think that there's something in him that really does see the consolation that comes in connection in times of grief and even in times of anger. That even then there's not as so much an isolating impulse as a connecting impulse.
There's a danger, I think, to love, right? I don't think there's any, that danger's never hidden in Lewis's work. I think there's a risk. Are you speaking
personally, or are you speaking for Lewis?
Well done. Well, I mean, you know, that moment in A Grief Observed, after he critiqued Augustine, right? You know, this, cancer, my mother, my father, my wife, you know, it's just, it's the least poetic and yet so full of meaning, that one phrase, you know, because he's just taught, you know, there's a weariness to the having loved and lost, and yet the risk is there. And I think The Great Divorce shows pretty well what happens to someone who chooses not to risk. These people end up wrapping themselves up, encasing themselves from the world, right? So you end up, it's a risk either way, but there's, building up, playing guitar to build up scabs on the strings, right? The scabs protect from the pain. Well, that can be a life damaging thing, but the scabs are awfully tempting at times, right? To seal up, what is it? To seal up our heart against the world. Is that the phrase? I can't remember if that's the exact phrase. Yeah.
My time is running out. I'm going to need to head out fairly soon, I'm afraid.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, no, we appreciate it. Just some comments here. Yeah, and if you have to slide out, that's great. Someone says, we should have heard Dr. Glyer's lecture on first dates. That would be kind of a good launching point. And so there's those things. And then before you slide out, I do want to note a thing from Daniel here, who talks about, going back to your comment on friendship and collaboration and things, as shared experiences build relationships even when they're not quest driven. And I guess this is more the conversation, shared creativity feeds on other shared creativity, and then goes from talking about, Daniel goes from talking about the Inklings to the Algonquin Round Table or pre-Raphaelite artists and other writing groups, and it is notable. I talked about Ellen Montgomery. She was absolutely alone in her literary endeavor. She had a lifetime of work with no literary friends, all by herself, and it's probably not accidental that there was a manuscript delivered to her publisher that tears down all her work delivered on the day she died, right? Because she just couldn't bear the world anymore. And I think those things can be connected, and friendship could have played that kind of transformational role for her. And Daniel also mentions the ebb and flow of groups of friends move closer and then further apart, and support and criticism, difference and change and adaptation and context and those sorts of things are important as well. So are you going to slide out, Diana? Sorry.
I have to. I'm so sorry. Thanks for the invitation.
That's great.
It's so good to, Jason, it's good to see you in person, more or less.
Yeah, that's right. And
we're getting there, university in June.
We'll see you in June. Yeah.
Full experience.
It'll be a great party at Taylor. I hope to meet many of the students as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
That's good. Thanks so much, Diana. And, good stuff. And so, and there were thanks that are coming in for Diana as well. So that will be something we want to consider. Now, I want to throw a question to you from Noam. Jason, how much is equality? So tell me, thinking about equality, is that essential for philia? Do friends need to be equals, or can there be inequality in that relationship?
Oh, that's a really difficult question. What do we mean by equality? Could you specify what kind of equality are we talking about?
So okay, yeah. So that's that would be a good thing to challenge. So so like Rich follows it up with a point. We talked about, we had Professor Sarah Brown lecture about friendship in the Lord of the Rings last week, and she talked about the relationship of Sam and Frodo, which is not exactly one of friend equality, but it's really more like, the squire, the knight and the squire, or the warrior and the Batman, or something like that. So there's this kind of supportive role that's there rather than one of friendship, and yet there is a sense in Lewis's work where there has to be kind of there can't be something coercive about friendship, right? So that kind of hierarchy is problematic. So how does that work?
So coercive. So by equality, what do we mean? Do we mean that one needs the other more? Is that
Well, yeah, I think we see relationships struggle when that's the case anyway, right? I don't know, maybe not in Storge family friendships, family relationships, but that's certainly the case in a lot of friendships. If or lovers, right? When one person needs the other more, that can be a challenging thing, yeah. And we can open this up. Noam, do you want to speak to that and just clarify that question a little bit more?
Because equality is a big word. Like, what do we mean by it? Aristotle says no. Friendship requires equality, and by that I think he means more like status in society. A slave master can't be a friend with a slave, right?
Yeah.
Then the Christian answer, apparently we can be friends with God, the creator of the universe. Now there's a disparity there. So that's a very different kind of understanding of friendship.
Well, let's have Noam push in on that, because I think it's a interesting question. Noam, do you want to speak to that just briefly?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with the motivation that got me to the question in the first place. I see Lewis's for love as being described from, and I'm going to use a very provocative word here, egoistic point of view. He looks and points, how do I fit in that relationship? And I wanted to take a step back and say, okay, if it's not me in the relationship, if I look at the relationship from the outside, do I see things that I don't see when I describe the relationship from the same point of view that Lewis does? For example, if two friends are talking and one of them is the one who initiates the conversation all the time, would that be a philia in Lewis's terms?
Mm.
Would it be from one member of a relationship of philia and not for the other? Does it has to be? Can I be your friend and you not be mine? So
Yeah.
that was the motivation of starting to ask about equality from that perspective. If we look from the outside, do two friends need to play sort of similar roles? Can we break this up? That was the motivation for the question.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. And Jason, I think you already started to speak to that, but do you want to follow up with that any more specifically? Yeah.
I'm reminded of a passage in this book. This, by the way, is this is the first edition. I'd pass it around if I could, and you could flip through the pages, and the smell of old books is like a time capsule, a time machine. It takes you back to 1950s, 60s. But I'm reminded of a passage where in the Four Loves, where Lewis says that. Oh, hold on. No one remind me what. Oh yes, the last thing you said in your comment just now, the outside perspective. Oh, I remember. Yes. So there's in the chapter of friendship, I think, Lewis claims that when one friend has to help the other, so there's a kind of a unilateral dependency. One is able to help the other. And in one way, there's a temporary inequality, which isn't a derogative term. I mean, if you fall in the river and I'm still standing, I'm in a position to pull you up. Does that make us unequal? Well, maybe for a while, but it doesn't. It's not the heart of our relationship or our friendship. If I fall into the river, you'll help me out. But Lewis says something like, these are interruptions of friendship. Remember that bit, that when one is in debt to the other, it's kind of an embarrassment or an interruption. And when you say, oh, don't mention it, you mean it literally. Let's not talk about it. Let's not talk about this thing that I did to you to help you, and let's get back to our relationship, which is free, which is uncoerced, which isn't dependent on debts or your gratitude to me. And so there is this gut instinct, this push away from dependencies in friendship, which may color the friendship or mar them if they get out of hand.
So I think that's a, and I'm glad you used that language. And so Kate was just when you said friendship with God, she was going to quote John 15:15 on the same thing. So she really is kind of right with us today. Emily D says, I was recently reading Till We Have Faces, and the fox tells Orwell that friends must be free, right? In this case, the fox recognizes coercion could be detrimental to the relationship, and so those are kind of two dynamics, right? But, there's the question, and Kate says, this is a question that might be a good one about the marauders from the Potter world, right? Where Peter Pettigrew wasn't a full friend and wasn't equal to them, even though each is dynamically diverse. He wasn't equal in the same kind of way, and Daniel says, the professors who's friend with a farmer can be equal as people or men when they see each other as stuff. But of course, there's actually another dynamic that goes on socially. And I wonder if we could use, Jason, that image in, in the A Grief Observed, which is written not long after The Four Loves, and is sort of Joy Davidman, contented, right? So The Four Loves is written with Joy Davidman at his elbow, and A Grief Observed is in response to Joy's death. where Lewis talks about, he changes the dynamic, you're my captain, you're my comrade, you're my mistress, you're my lover, you're my master, you're my mate, all this kind of, these different things, my captain, there's, and he talks elsewhere about that there's actually a dance of inequalities, or so that, so Lewis doesn't resisted the idea of equality, because I think in his culture the word sameness was walking around in that idea. So equality was something that was same, right? As in 4 apples and 4 apples, or 4 kinds of fruit and 4 kinds of fruit, that's equal. But equality as kind of diversity bound up with a sense of the other being, different and separate was really important to Lewis, and that best gets kind of captured with this dance, right? Where all kinds of different things. What does it say in Paralandra, where all things are moving out from the center, and yet all is in the center, right? This kind of contrasting, kind of pulling together of things. Does that make sense? Where Noam's right. Domination's problematic. You're right. Debt is problematic. Social status doesn't have to be problematic, and that's clearly an inequality, right? So yeah, we want to hold these two things together somehow, right?
Lewis's understanding of friendship is surprisingly modern. It's very inclusive if you think about it. When he highlights the naked personalities, and friends, aren't interested in each other's paychecks. All right, you don't have to be a white, middle-class, well-educated Oxford Don to be my friend. This is very inclusive. He is breaking boundaries in the talks, the radio talks that preceded the book. He even lists nationality as one of these things that friendship doesn't care about. He's exaggerating, doesn't care about, meaning that your nationality doesn't bar our friendship.
Yeah.
And I don't think he's given credit enough for the inclusivity of his quite Catholic understanding of friendship in the minor case C.
Minor case C, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what this book is about. It's The Taste for the Other by Gilbert Meilander or whatever, where he's really, really drove for me how important other, like, distinctiveness or difference and diversity is in relationships, in church, in society, and those sorts of things. And that love, because I think we define diversity just a wee bit different today, but still there's at the root something that's shared. Takako here talks about, we will often feel inferior to our best friends, and maybe even lucky to be their friends, right? And so that's another dynamic of equality, inequality, where we want to imagine ourselves as unequal, right? That we've lucked out, there was something serendipitous or providential.
They're gonna call me out. They're gonna call me out soon. I don't belong here.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. There's, and not identity crisis, but that kind of,
imposter syndrome in friendship.
Yeah, that's right.
Academics talk about imposter syndrome, and students talk about imposter syndrome, where you think everybody else is smarter than you, and you don't belong here, and it's some sort of fluke that allowed you to enter this institution. And so maybe there's in some circles of friendship, you have this imposter syndrome as well. I am lucky to call these people friends. I don't know what they get from me, but man, just allow me to tag along for a couple more years, please.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, Brenton, because maybe you could help me out with this, and others might find this interesting as well. We've referred to a lot of fiction. We've talked about, Narnia, obviously. We mentioned The Great Divorce. A Grief Observed, approaches fiction. Lewis, it's not strictly autobiographical. We don't know. Lewis deliberately invented some stuff, exaggerated other things, and downplayed other things to hide his identity. but it is still, it's closer to biography than it is to fiction. But so my question as a scholar is how do we make sure we're not reading into the fiction of authors' opinions, say about friendship, that the authors themselves personally may not have endorsed, right? This is a perennial problem in scholarship, and so I'm still trying to figure out the best way to say it. Does anyone know if there's if the rule or the principle has been coined? I don't know what the word would be, but I'll describe it. In biblical terms, it's doing exegesis instead of eisegesis. You actually look at your source and you pull out stuff. Exegesis, you pull out stuff that are genuinely there instead of eisegesis, which you read into your sources that may or may not be there, and which is a bit irresponsible from the scholarship point of view. And so when we ask questions like, what did Tolkien think of friendship? What did Lewis think of erotic love? Oh, well, in Narnia and The Lord of the Rings, this or that. I'm not sure if this is the best way to do it. So the first thing to do is to establish the answers using more straightforward biographical material. And only then you can corroborate, then you can see applications of these ideas, or even contradictions in the literature, in the fictional literature, not vice versa. So I wonder, do you, Brenton, or does anyone out there know if literary theory has coined this principle? Is there a handy shorthand that I could use?
Yeah, well, Lewis actually coined it himself.
Not personal heresy.
Yeah. Well, you mean that, right? You're asking the question of what he wanted to do was challenge the way that we were reading through. We were reading through to the author that sits behind the text, and he wanted to challenge that, because in a poem, the poem could be about storming the hill and courage in storming the hill. It didn't mean that the poet was courageous, right? Or it didn't mean, or even that the poet was patriotic or non-pacifistic. It just meant that in the poem, the person storming the hill. And so I think the caution that he gives in the personal heresy is really kind of helpful. But I guess a couple of, you kind of answer it yourself. One is we would want to, in this case, we can ask so when I'm done answering this question here, which I'm sure I'll answer it, no one will ever have to ask the question again. When we're done this part of the discussion, what I'm going to do to close off, because we're coming down to the bottom of the half hour here, to close off, what I want you folks to do is put in your kind of favorite or most disturbing or something moment of Narnia and friendship. And you can even extend out to kind of the Lewis and Friends if you want to do something from Tolkien or from one of the readers of Lewis, Madeline L'Engle or Harry Potter or something like that. So you go ahead and do that. Put that in the boxes there, and if you want to share it, then you go ahead and put your hand up. And this will be rapid fire. This is super quick. We want to finish off the hour, but I think Kate says textual respect. I think what we do is, there's a point in Magician's Nephew where Lewis describes what a king will be, first in the battle, the person that will eat the least food at the banquets when there's times of want, but will have the greatest smile on his face. He has all these values of kingship. Are those Lewis's values of kingship? I think to say that, we have to correlate with his biography. And so I think, there's until then we're playing with possibilities. However, we can say, the text says this. We just don't know what the value of the text is. When one of the characters, Lucy or Susan, says, boys are the worst. Well, I don't know that Lewis thought that boys were the worst. I think, that he was being playful. And so I think there's a caution there. And so that's kind of the way that I approach it. And we always kind of keep correlating it back. But Lewis did say in Allegory of Love that, he was in that project reading through the text to the culture that existed there behind it. And so there was a whole school of literary criticism, literary theory that used Lewis's personal heresy to launch a text-only world. But Lewis himself didn't trap himself with the text. The Discarded Image, Allegory of Love, the Oxford History of English Literature in the 16th century. These were books that Lewis was really interested in the culture there. So he is reading through the books, but he's cautious about that when it comes to the author. But we have quite a lot about Lewis's life, so we have some ability to play with that. And that's how I do it in my work. I'd be uncomfortable. So in when I write, I tend to say, give a kind of maybe a teaser from the fiction or the poetry, then the non-fiction kind of exegesis, and then I'll use fiction as the examples, right? That's how I want to do. But even in scripture, we have this problem, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes people are speaking, if one of the kings in Daniel says, throw them into the fire, I don't think we're supposed to go around looking for young Jewish scholars and trying to cast them into furnaces. I think generally we would say that wasn't the command for us in all times, right? So we're always doing this, I think, asking who's speaking, to whom are they speaking, and where do we sit as the reader, right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've understood personal heresy slightly differently. It's almost like the reverse of personal heresy that I'm trying to capture. Like, I'm trying to find a word for the reverse of personal heresy. If the personal heresy is this, which Lewis objected to, this idea that you need to know you need to know intimate biographical details about the author in order to really to understand the text. And he says, no, you look at the text speaks for itself, it has value in itself. What I'm trying to find, this is why I'm unsure about whether personal heresy captures it. I'm trying to find a word for the process in which you bracket the literature and you just look at the man, the woman, the author, and you establish your ideas first using biographical sources, and then you have this canvas against which you can then evaluate fiction that they wrote and parse and differentiate between what they actually believe personally and what they just put in their characters.
Yeah, I don't know that there's a word for it. To be fair, I just talk about integrative reading.
What do you talk about?
Integrative, to integrate, integrative reading. And it's
reading.
Yeah, it's unsexy. It's what good historians do. It's what good text critics do, which is simply, we don't claim what we have no method for affirming. And that includes, it doesn't mean a reader can't say, I was moved by this moment in this text and this is what it means to me. We're not saying that. We're simply talking about when people want to push through and paint upon the canvas of the author's life, the thing that they read from the text can be different, because Lewis is hiding himself and revealing himself all over the place in the text.
Yep. All the time.
Yeah.
And we should come up with a sexy.
Yeah, I'll come up with a sexy title. The Lepojärvi approach. Okay, so so what I'm doing is you can raise your hand or you can put it in the comment box and we'll finish this off because I think this is a great way of doing this. What are the kind of, for you, the favorite or the kind of more problematic moments of Narnia and friendship, or you can extend out and we can include some other things, and I'll just kind of read some of these things up here. I do want to know, Kate said, the diversity question and the question of the other and the importance of otherness. Of course, look at Reepicheep and Eustace, right? Can you have two more diametrically opposed figures who then become collegial and close as time goes on? So thinking of friendship and maybe problematic, Noam says the problem of Susan. I think there's some great questions to ask there. Because friendship with Narnia is kind of one of the themes that comes up in that thing there. She's no longer a friend of Narnia. Kate says, I love the awkward friendship between Aravis and Shasta. I think that's a great, and isn't it intriguing, the boy-girl friendships that take place in throughout Narnia, we're teaching later, actually in about half an hour, we're going through Catherine Patterson's Bridge to Terabithia, and it was considered this breakout book for talking about boy-girl friendships that weren't romantic necessarily. Well, I don't know. I think Narnia's just kind of filled with them, not to take away from this.
Another testimony to Lewis's inclusivity, right? So that's another barrier that he breaks, friendship between the sexes.
That's right, yeah. And Emily A says, the moment in the silver chair when Jill and Eustace call each other by their first names, right? Really kind of an important point. The bell, Donald. Yeah, Donald G says the bell on the table in the magician's moment is that moment of the greatest unknown danger, right? And their friendship is so tested kind of in that particular moment, right? Daniel moves out a little bit to George MacDonald with Donal Grant and Gibbie. And those are great friendship books. And Donal Grant, you should know that part of the series that there's a new translation series by David Jack that's been coming out. The Donal Grant was just published this week. They're beautifully designed, and they have the Scots stuff in translation with the English stuff, so you can find those now in a way that you haven't been able to find them for quite some time. Aslan and Diggory both crying because Diggory's mother is ill. Right, there's real, a comradeship, a type of friendship in a moment of darkness. Gabriel says, yeah, that's a lovely moment there. When Peter declares Kate says when Peter declares that Susan's no longer a friend of Narnia, certainly. Daniel, there's always a certain element of fiction and looking back, but also in self-revelation from the writers themselves. Memory, interpretation vary from the fact by nature, even when well meant. And I think we could maybe we'll have to talk about the personal heresy and the unsexy literary theory of Jason and Brenton. We'll have to do an open session on that, on reading well. So
I think we should call it the Dickieson principle. It sounds sexy.
but it's used. Yeah, no, it's like I harp. Like I'm really hard on students about it, and I'm really hard on critics about it, but only because so many have done it so badly. But this is what good historians, good readers, good critics have done, without saying it out loud for a long time. So I don't think, and Daniel says there could be, legend and rumor, are in publishing. There's a shock value that we have to be careful of, right? Impersonal orthodoxy, Kate says, as a response to the personal heresy.
Impersonal orthodoxy.
Yeah, that's right. And Noam asked the question of our authorial intent, which is sort of bound up on that. Oh, there's all kinds of great comments here. Integration versus dissection, Kate agrees, is good. And we read into things where we are, Daniel says. Yeah, good. All right, so back to the friendship stuff. I'm really tempted to go down that road, but I really want to close this off to honor the time. Jamie says, this is not a friend of Lewis, but one of my favorite character friendships is Alcott's 8 cousins. So Louisa May Alcott's 8 cousins. Rose begins as a completely isolated orphan who finds herself surrounded by 8 male cousins, and the relationship she develops with each of the cousins is unique, and eventually marries one of them. And that's okay back, when Louisa May Alcott's writing. And she surprises her aunt by saying that the person she truly appreciates is Phoebe, a maid in the household who doesn't measure up to everybody else in the family. Yeah, so there's a real kind of challenge of social dynamics, rethinking all those kind of relational matrices, to play off a phrase that Jason used earlier in the hour. And Takako said, okay, I'll end with that one, Takako. And Dennis, yeah, David Jack, not David Jacks. Yeah, you have to, the auto mechanic imagery of Diana. We don't want to forget that when we're doing good reading, so. All right, so yeah, okay, so good. Yeah, so Daniel, I didn't know that we met at Talia. They're great to reconnect with you there. And I do, Takako says, and I've been curious about it. I have some ideas of what we're talking about. Takako wants to know what that thing is on the wall behind you.
It is birch.
Yeah.
It is birch. What do you call it?
Bark?
Birch bark. Thank you.
Yeah, birch bark. Yeah.
It's kind of neat, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, that's so Canadian. I just want to say it may be Finnish too.
It's also Finnish. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's also Finnish. But yeah, that's so like kind of to take take the woods that you can't go to in winter and put in your home is a great way to kind of, it's almost hoogie, right? You know, there's kind of the, you know, hoogie licked kind of thing, but of course that's not finished. So, all right. So, okay, that's it. I want to close things off. Thank you, everyone. So I want to thank Diana Glyer. Make sure you check out her books. If you're interested in the scholarly stuff, the company they keep, if you're interested in the more personal kind of application stuff, her Bandersnatch book is pretty cool. Jason Lepojärvi's thesis is actually available for free. He's decided to let it out for free on academia, and you can also get that through the show notes and through my own the blog where we did the announcements, and we'll make sure that's included at the end with some social media contact. Of course, scholars do a lot of the work that they do really for free and often pay to do it. So make sure you take the opportunity to share their work and engage with it in your own reading and scholarship so that you have a chance to make that connection there. Daniel says, by the way, you're with that birch bark, you're halfway to making your own boat. Sorry. And there's some thanks coming in to Jason and Diana there. And so thanks everybody. Watch for this on Signum University's YouTube channel within the next week or so. And if you have other ideas for things you want us to talk about, send us a note. And of course, you know, we are a university with an amazing MA in language and literature with 5 great streams of programs. Plus I'm trying to secretly create an entire, you know, rebellious C.S. Lewis minor or major. So keep yeah, that's right. Exactly. Keep on that because it can be a secret. That's right. It can be a lot of fun. Thanks everybody. Good job, folks. And we'll see you on the other side. Bye-bye now. Thanks.